Hey everyone, thanks for joining and happy Friday. My name is Rakesh Gupta. I'm co-host of this webinar with Michelle Hansen. I will cover a couple of logistics slide and then hand over to the speaker. Sarah, can you go to the next slide? Here are the logistics. Online will be muted. Please feel free to post your question in GoToWebinar chat or Trailblazer community. We will post this recording after this session into our YouTube channel, Automation Hour. Feel free to subscribe our Twitter or newsletter so that you will get all the updates in your inbox. Next. We have solid lineup for this year, and if you have any topic that you would like us to cover, or if you want to share your experience with the community, feel free to reach out to me or Michelle, and we would love to have you in one of the upcoming webinar. Next. And this session was not possible without our sponsor. Concrete.io is sponsoring us from last 6 years, and we have a couple of other sponsors. Sumo Scheduler and Active Campaign. Those are the sponsors for this email that you receive in your inbox. So thanks for Active Campaign and all other sponsors for sponsoring us to have this webinar free of cost. Next. And here is your co-host, Michelle Hansen and Rakesh Gupta. I started this webinar 6 years back with Jennifer Lee and David Layton, and now Michelle joined last year, and we are still running this. So next. And with that said, we have our speaker, Sarah Filger. So he's talking about the ScreenFlow, and Salesforce Flow is now very powerful tool. I started using in 2013, and after 10 years, it become much more powerful with having data tables, lookups, and Lightning Web Component inject into the ScreenFlow. So to you, Sarah.
Great. So it looks like my bio slide here was hidden from view. I forgot that I had to share that, but I'll just start with a little introduction of myself. My name is Sarah Pilzer, and I am the Director of Technology for a organization called the Country Dance and Song Society. We are a participatory arts nonprofit, and we use ScreenFlows for all kinds of things. And I'm really excited to talk to you about today about ScreenFlows because they are like one of my all-time favorite Salesforce features. And I'm just going to dive right in because I have a lot to cover, and I know we don't have a lot of time, and I want to leave lots of time for questions. So what makes ScreenFlows so very special? They are a way that allow us to interact, create ways for our users to provide data to us and allow them to interact with records in Salesforce by creating wizard-like forms and that walk users through entering only the relevant data that they need in order to create records in Salesforce. And they're highly customizable, as I will show you today with some examples. So where might you find ScreenFlows in a Salesforce org? We're going to be taking a look at a demo org of mine called the Otter Appreciation Society. And you'll see that there's ScreenFlows throughout this org. There's places on the app homepage. We have 2 different ScreenFlows here that are just displaying images for us to showcase special graphics. Or you might find a ScreenFlow on a specific record page that allows the user to interact with that record's data specifically. If you want to be able to launch a ScreenFlow from anywhere in Salesforce, you can add that ScreenFlow to the utility bar in your Lightning apps. And then they can just click on that little button in the corner and it'll pop right up no matter where they are in Salesforce. And one thing that we do at my organization is we have an Experience Cloud site that allows us to expose ScreenFlows to our external users. And this is a way that we do a lot of data collection for our camp registration, for our camp registrations, members, donors. This allows us to both show them a little bit of the data that we have in Salesforce and collect data, but in a very controlled way without opening up access to everything. So let's get right to building a ScreenFlow. I think this is as simple as 1, 2, 3. There are some more details than that, but as with all new flows, We start by opening up Flow Builder, clicking on that New Flow button, and then selecting ScreenFlow as the type for the new flow that you want to build. And it wouldn't be a ScreenFlow if it doesn't have a screen, right? So the first thing we want to do is add a screen element. In auto layout, you can do that by selecting the screen from that element drop-down list that comes when you click that little plus button. Or if you happen to be in free-form mode, which I will admit I prefer at times, the screen elements are listed in that toolbox over to the left-hand side of the screen, and you just drag that onto your center canvas there. Once you have a screen in your flow, it's time to configure that screen. And so in this case, all of the things that you can add to your screen are called components, and they live over here in this left-hand panel. The center of the configuration screen is what I refer to as the canvas, and this is where you drag the components, where you move them around. This is sort of a what you see is what you get version of what your screen is going to look like when you activate your flow. And then on the right-hand panel, we have the properties panel, or this is where you set specific configurations that define the component that you're putting onto your screen. Now, if you've ever used Lightning App Builder, you'll see this is a very similar layout. So just like if you're creating a record page for like a custom record page or a dynamic record page, if you're used to doing that, creating screens in Flow is practically the same thing, right? We have their components panel, our center canvas, and then our properties pane. So if you've built a Lightning page, you can build a screen. Now let's take a look at a little bit of this in practice. So here we're going to go ahead and add a simple screen. And it's important that even in demos, we provide a name for our screen and a description of what it does. And then we begin dragging components onto the screen and setting the various properties for each one. You'll notice that I'm going to use a naming convention here that tells me what kind of component this is and that it's on the screen 1, S01. You don't have to use the same convention that I do, but I do recommend naming your components in a standardized way so that you can find them more easily later on in your flows. Some components require more entry to set them up. So in this case, I want to say required because email is a more complicated component. I needed to set it using a global constant as true to have it required rather than just checking a box. Now, let's go ahead and add some fancy bells and whistles to the screen. I'm going to display an image, a fun image, and I'm going to put a little bit of text on the screen. Now, I couldn't find the display text component right away, so I went ahead to that find the search box and typed in display to bring it up right to the top. You can go ahead and filter that long list of components by doing that. So now we're done configuring our screen. We're going to go ahead and save the flow. And I'm going to open up the debugger just to take a look at what that screen is going to look like for my users. And there we have it. Pretty simple, right? That was like, what, a couple minutes. So I'm going to go over just a few of my favorite, most frequently used components that you might run into during ScreenFlow building. This is by far not an exhaustive list. And if you find that you need even more components, you can find them either on the App Exchange or through one of my favorite websites for Flownatics, unofficialsf.com. I highly recommend checking out that resource. We're going to go ahead and start with the section component. Now, this component is more of a layout component, but it allows you to break up the screen into different areas where I can put components next to each other, and it allows me to fine-tune what my screen is going to look like. So it's sort of like laying out the template for your screen, as it were. Screens, unlike record pages, don't come with pre-made templates. You kind of have to define that for yourself as you're building them. So the next component, display text, is probably the component I use more than any other. And what this component does is it allows you to type anything you like into a display box, change the formatting, include pictures. You can even reference record data with merge fields. and then it just shows up as text on your screen. I use this all the time for writing instructions for my wizards, and it's kind of similar, like if you've ever built an email template in Salesforce, this is a little bit similar to that in that it's your rich text editor that will be what you see when you open the screen. Now, the counterpart for that is if we're displaying text, we also want to accept text. We want to take in text input from our users. Most input components are going to be similar to what you've seen as the various fields that are available on a record. So the same way you can enter a text field on a record, that's what a text input component does on a screen flow. And text input is probably one of the most basic input components there are. It just allows you to type in a string of text, and then you can reference it later in your flow, and we'll see how that works. Long text area is the same as the text input, but it allows for, well, longer bits of text. So again, these two inputs correspond to the text and the text area field types on objects. You can add pick lists to your field. This is similar to having a pick list on an object, but what's important to note here in screen flows and in flows in general, if you want to have a pick list, you have to tell Flow what the values in that pick list are going to be. It doesn't necessarily know right away because it doesn't know what object you're working on or any of that. It's just an empty pick list, and we have to fill it. And the way we do that is with these choice resources. And there's a couple different ways to create choice resources in Flow. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds of that today, but just know you can either set them up manually by specifying what those values should be, or you can use a pick list on an existing object. If you happen to know that field and you want to use those values, you can specify that in your choice resources, or you can even make a selection, a set of choices from a collection of records, say that you've pulled into your flow with a get records. So yeah, just when you're setting up your pick list, you have to specify what the choices are going to be. The checkbox works almost exactly like you would expect it to. It's just a true-false component that allows somebody to check a box on your screen flow. And you can specify whether it's unchecked or checked by default by using that true-false global constant that we saw a little bit earlier. And that's a standard constant that comes with flow. So every flow you can reference global constants as values in your flow, and it'll always be true or always be false. So that's what we have set there for the default value, which I forgot to mention earlier, but a lot of components will allow you to set a default so that when your user opens up the screen, there's already a little bit of something in there to either prompt them or as sort of the save them some entry, data entry, save them clicks by, let's say almost 90% of the time you're going to have this checkbox click to true. You can default it to true so that they don't have to click it every time, and it saves your users time. That's a feature my users really appreciate, is when I default things for them. Lookup fields are handy in that they allow users to pick a record that they might want to do something with later in the flow. But they're a little bit funny to configure, so I don't actually use them all that often. You have to configure them by looking for a child object and then referencing the parent, the lookup field, to the parent as the API name for the lookup field. And I find them, I actually run into trouble with these sometimes, but they are really useful for allowing your users to find a record they want to work with. Radio buttons are very similar to pick lists, but instead of having that drop-down list, you just get a list of buttons to choose from. Again, note that we're configuring it using choices, which are that choice resource I mentioned a little bit earlier. And then finally, one of the more complex components that I use a lot is this data table component, which is sort of like a lookup component, but instead of searching just one record, you can actually input a collection of records. So in this case, I have using a source collection of accounts that I got earlier in my flow. I used to get records to find a set of accounts. and then I'm displaying them to the user in this data table, and it creates a nice interface for them to select certain ones that I can then look at later in the flow. So give them a whole collection, they select down just the ones they want to look at. You can store that output that we can then reference later in the flow. I will also mention that this data table component is kind of a recent addition to the standard components, and it's inspired by a version from unofficial SF, which I mentioned earlier, that the unofficial SF version has a few more bells and whistles, so you can check that out if you're looking for an upgrade to your data tables. So we mentioned that you can reference components later on in the flow, like I talked a lot about. Once you have this input, what do you want to do with it after it's been input? It's only as useful as you like. It's only useful if you can then reference it later in other places in your flow. So let's see how we can do some of that. So one way is if you have a component like a text component, you can directly reference that component's API name later on in the field, later on in the flow. And what that'll do is it'll take whatever value your user put into that component. Flow will say, get that value and assign it. In this case, we're assigning it to the account name of a record variable, but it knows what was put in there. And if you reference it using the API name, it will take that value and like hold it. So basically components are a little bit like variables in Flow, in that they hold whatever input was given to them until you need it later in your flow. And some components handle this differently. So for example, the text component, you can directly reference that output, whereas others, you need to sort of store that output in a variable. So here we're looking again at that data table record. And what I've decided is, okay, take those selected records, and I'm going to store them as a collection in a collection record variable that I have already created in my flow. So I've already created the empty container to hold the input from my component, and now I'm storing that output value from the component in that empty container, and it will become full of the records that were chosen in the data table. I can then reference that same variable, my collection of accounts, later on in my flow. So for example, I have a sort element later in my flow, and now I've said, take the collection variable that had stored all of those referenced records from the data table and sort them by active in this case. Some components come with built-in variables. So in the case of the lookup that we were looking at before, it actually stores the whole record. The lookup component will take the record that was chosen by the user and store that record, and then we can reference fields from that record without having to do any assignments or any of that. We can directly reference the component and the fields on the record from that component. So it's kind of all packaged together nicely by Salesforce. By saying, hey, I know you were looking up a record, I'm going to take that record and store it for you, and then you can reference it later by using the component name. Alternatively, you can create your own variables like we did for that collection, or in the same case with the account lookup, I could store just the record ID as a text variable that I have created in my flow, and then reference that instead in my get records. And both this and the previous example will have the exact same output. In this case, it's going to find that account that was selected in the lookup and use it as in the get records. But just showing the difference between either using the variables that come with some components or setting your own. So I think I'm going to pause there for a minute to see if there's any questions. I know I just threw a lot of information at you. So do we have any questions yet?
Hey, Sarah, can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
Awesome. All right, so we have several questions that came in. The first is from, I think it's Hosu. I probably butchered your name, so I really apologize for that. But the question is, where did your naming convention come from? It reminds them of something that was read on the Salesforce Discord Exchange wiki.
I was inspired by, I found a wiki page called Flow Naming Conventions Wiki, and I can get that information out to folks after, that I used as inspiration and then sort of adapted it to my own use. And it was mostly talking about what to name your flows as a whole, like what API name to give the whole flow. And then I adapted it down to individual elements and then even individual components on the screens. It's a great question, though.
Absolutely. I know there's lots of different naming convention versions out there, and I think it's important that A, you have one, and B, you're consistent with it, right?
Yep.
Awesome. So Sita thought it was pretty cool that you were pulling in that section header and wanted to know, how do I add more sections? So like if I want 3 or more columns, can I do that?
Yeah. Let me jump back to that slide for a minute. It's pretty far back, but we'll get there. So as you can see in the components, or sorry, in the properties panel side here, there's a little button there that says add column. You can have up to 4 columns right now. That's as many as they allow you to have. And the number 6 of 12, for example, this is getting a little bit far into the details, but the Salesforce Lightning design system breaks up every screen into 12 sections. So you can say how many pieces of that screen do you want each column to take up. Basically, it's setting the width. 6 is half, 1 is the smallest component. So when you configure your sections, you can add 1, 2, 3, or 4 columns. And then to get additional sections, you would just drag another section component onto your screen. So you can stack components, or stack sections, and then break them up into 4 columns each. What you cannot do yet, and I am hopeful that someday this will be possible, is put sections within other sections. So there have been times when I wanted to have one column that was just one column, and then another column that the top part was 2 sections, but then the bottom was only 1, and that's not quite possible yet. But maybe there's an idea on the idea exchange. If not, I'll create one.
That would be cool. I'll totally vote for that if you send me a link. So Julia would like to know, can you default to an address that's already inputted? So I think this is probably just a great in general question. Can you use defaults?
Yes, I don't have an example of that in the slides, but we can maybe take a look at it when I jump to the demo. But in the default section here, so let's look at this text input, for example, where it says default value. Right now, I've just typed in text that I want there, but you can use what I consider like, there's sort of like merge fields in that as well. And when you click into your default value, a lot of times it's going to let you look up a resource from elsewhere in the flow and use that as a default value. Different components are all kind of different in the way that they do that. So some will let you do that, some won't, unfortunately. I can't remember if the address field component specifically, how that works with defaults. It's might be a little bit trickier, but a lot of times what I'll do is if I can't do what I want with a specific component, I'll sort of fake it with some other ones. So let's say I wanted to write an address and I couldn't use a default in the address component as it was, I might just use text inputs instead and then store those later as an address on a record. And then I could use the default value for the text input and take values from, let's say, a record that I've already pulled into my flow that has that default already filled in, or even like maybe Julia was saying, I could reference a screen component from an earlier screen and have that be the default value on a later screen.
Very cool. All right, so Hosu is back with another question. When selecting records from a data table, are there considerations around performance or CPU limits?
I haven't run into those. I suspect you would be you know, Flow has its own set of limits, governor limits, the same way Apex does. So it might be a limit of how many records you can pull in total, but once they're in the data table itself, I don't think there's any additional limits just from a data table. It's more like the bigger outside limits of like how many records can you pull in a flow period, that kind of thing, or like how many SOQL queries can you do, which is basically what pulling a record into a flow is.
Yep, makes perfect sense. So then Sita came back and basically wanted to know data tables can help you show the number of records, kind of like a list view.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have used them sort of as that in the past. Like you can just display a set of records that don't even have to be necessarily related to the record that you're looking at. So you can embed a screen flow on a record page and then pull in records that are distantly related. So they're sort of like a cool way of doing a related list that's not even related. I've definitely done that before.
Very cool. We might need to invite you back to show that. So, all right, that concludes our questions for
Great.
now.
Well, let us zip on down then to, so like I said, I'm going to use our Otter Appreciation Society, which is my made up nonprofit, to do a use case on building an internal ticketing system with screen flows. So what OAS wants to do is they want to be able to allow users to request help for issues with existing features, and they want users to be able to suggest new features to add to their Salesforce instance. So we're going to use a screen flow that's going to create a case record that is either of one of those two types. So we're going to use record types to set up for each case. And this is some stuff I've already configured in Otter Appreciation Society's org. And we're going to dive into the screen flow part, but there was some previous setup, such as creating those record types, etc. Then we're going to collect user input, and we're going to use that to create a new case. So I'm going to end the slideshow, and then hopefully pull up my, hopefully you can see my flow here. Is that right? Let's see the.
I'm probably a bad person to ask. I think my internet is lagging.
Well,
somebody said no so far. What I'm seeing is just the Windows blue screen.
Oh yeah, okay, 1 second.
Please hold for technical difficulties. Go to webinar is sometimes a challenge.
Yep. Just gonna go ahead and show our switch monitors then showing. There we go. That should be, we could be seeing a list of flows here now.
Yes.
Great. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and open up the home page just to do a quick overview of what we're going to see when we're done with this process. Is I've gone ahead and added this flow here, the internal case flow, to my utility bar so that anytime a user in the Otter Appreciation Society is having either a hard time with an existing feature or they want to suggest something new, they can go ahead and click that button and submit a case. So let's say in this case, we're having issues with something. I'm going to go ahead and collect data from my user. Let's see. Oh, I don't know. Too complex. I can't find my record. I don't know what's going on. This is high priority. One thing that's funny about screen flows is you can provide an opportunity for people to enter data, but it's still only as good as the data that they enter. So, and if I go ahead and click next, it's going to go and create a case. And if I want to, I can click on that case and it's going to open up that case that I just created. So that's where we're going with this. And that's sort of the final version, but I want to show you where this started because it's a little bit of a simpler version of it that is a nice place to start with. So here is our flow. Let's just zoom out just a titch so you can see the whole thing. And you'll notice that so far we've only really talked about these screen elements. Flows have a whole bunch of other elements that are what allow us to do that interaction with the data. I know that this series, Automation Hour, has been doing this whole year. You've talked about some of these other pieces of flow building earlier in the series, so I'm going to really concentrate on the screen part, but just know that what the magic of screen flows is not just the screen, but all of the data elements that you get to add to it so that you can interact with that information. So let's just dive into this particular flow. And like I said, this is an earlier version just for demonstration purposes that I created a simple radio button here that allowed you to either select internal support or feature request. And again, this is where I've created those choices that I was mentioning in the slideshow. If we go ahead and look at what those choices look like in our toolbox, you'll see that each choice, I've just created a manual choice here where the label, that's what's going to show to the user, is feature request. The data type it's outputting is text, and the value is going to be feature request. So when somebody clicks on feature request in this radio button in the screen, it's going to store that value, feature request. It's going to remember, oh yeah, radio button 01, that's now feature request. That equals feature request. Here is an example of, we have two sections. This first section, I'm not including headers in these sections. I could, but in this case, they're just headerless, as it were. And one of them is for internal support fields, and the other one is for feature request fields. And what I want to show you here is you might notice this little eyeball icon. What that's saying is that I have set conditional component visibility. So this is only going to show, this whole section is only going to show when that first radio button field, remember this field here, when it equals the internal support choice. So if they've selected, the user selects internal support choice, this section will pop up. And if they select feature on the radio buttons, this bottom section will pop up and they won't see the other one and vice versa. So that's a really cool trick that you can do with screen flows to sort of consolidate your screens. You don't have to do a whole decision of like, oh, which one did they pick and then go to a different screen based off of what they picked. You can do it all on one screen now. So that's pretty cool. And it is, again, similar to if you've used conditional visibility on your record pages. It's a very, very similar thing. So the screen is going to collect some information here in the top section when we're talking about internal support. I just have a bunch of text inputs. I have a couple pick lists. I have one long text, everything we've talked about so far. Here's that email field. But down here, things look a little bit different. And what I want to show you here is there is another option for screen flows that you can directly reference fields on a record variable from your flow. And it'll sort of do a lot of that configuring for you. So in this case, I have an object, a record variable called case new. And this is, again, that blank vessel where I'm going to store all of the data that I'm collecting about the new case I want to create at the end of the flow. And this is where I'm going to assign all of those values. However, with the fields, and this is a feature called dynamic forms for flow. What you can do with your fields tab here is, depending on the type of object that this record variable is, it'll show me all the fields on that kind of object. And then I can just drag these fields the same way I would drag a component onto my screen. And now when somebody fills out this field on the screen, or this component on the screen, I guess I should say, it'll automatically store it in this variable for me. I don't need to do an assignment for it, which is a pretty cool thing. So in this case, we have case type, which is a field, object, which is a field that sort of specifies, oh, if this is creating a new field on, I want to create a new field on a custom object, I would say what kind of object it was, that kind of thing. Who's requesting it, what department they're from, all of these fields with these icons are fields that are actually on the case object. And we can see that if we go to the object manager and we look at case, and we look for some of those fields. So, oh, it's just called type, right? So we're going to have type, and so this field here with all these different types available is what we're going to see as a pick list here. So whatever these fields are, they will be the same type of input as they are on your object. So if it's a pick list, it'll be a pick list. If it's a text, it'll be a text, et cetera, et cetera. This one is a long text field. And again, you can see that the properties field over here looks a little bit different than if I was configuring a long text component. A lot of this has been set for me. And what's interesting, there was a question about defaults earlier. If I wanted to set a default here, right, I just type it in. Or if I want to, I can reference some of those other data in my flow from earlier. So like, let's say I wanted to put an ID in here. This little curly brackets say, oh, that's a variable from elsewhere in your flow, right? But whatever it is, I just sort of type it all in here, and that becomes the default value for that field, for that component. However, if you're using the dynamic forms, the default is what was stored in this record variable before you got to that screen. So it's a little bit more complicated in terms of if you want to set a default there. But sometimes if you've already pulled a record in and you have that record, it takes care of setting the defaults for you. So that's just something to be watching out for. So then what this flow does in very simple terms is you collect the information you want. It decides what kind of record we're going to create. Is it going to be an internal support case record or a feature request? For the internal support, we're going to do a few additional assignments. So here again, I'm using that record variable from before, and I'm setting all of its fields based off of my screen components. So I'm saying, okay, what was the subject from the screen component? I'm going to put it in the subject of the case. What was the description? I'm going to put that in the description of the case, so on and so forth. You'll notice a few of those assignments I have just set as plain text. I've just put in whatever text, or I'm using some fields from other places in the flow, in this case, the user variable. So you don't only have to use inputs from your screen flow to set your fields on the records that you're going to create, but it is one thing that you can do. For the feature request, I'm not going to set any additional fields because the way that we've collected it here, I don't have to do that assignment. Remember, we're already assigning it on the screen itself. I don't have to do the same thing as I'm doing here for the internal one where I'm assigning it to each of those fields. And again, this is one of those examples where Salesforce gives you options about ways to do things. And which way you prefer might be personal preference, or sometimes depending on different circumstances, it's nice to be able to do it in different ways. Once we've set the fields, we gotta go ahead and just get the record type ID, because we're setting, this is one of those just best practices, is you don't want to hard code IDs in Flow, because if you have that ID is very specific to the environment you're working in. If you're working in a sandbox, it's going to change when you move to production. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and look up a record type. The name is based off of what was selected as the choice on that first screen flow. And here, again, this is a place where it takes, it pays off to pay a little attention to how you set up your choices. Because, for example, this choice, I'm going to have the text be the output. This name matches exactly the record type that I want to create for that case. So I'm going to get the case record type. I'm going to assign that, as well as some other just standard, like the status is always going to be new, the case origin is always going to be flow. So no matter, after I've branched, they come back together, they both get that assignment. And then I create the new case using that record variable. Voila. I'll pause here for any questions about the simple version, and then hopefully take a few minutes to show you some of the bells and whistles I added in V2.
Sure, we got plenty more questions coming in, Sarah. So
Mhm.
Sunil chimed in with you can also use $email
Oh, yeah.
as one of the default values, which is cool. So Sita would like to know, is there a way to pull the record type in
Sorry,
to
hold the
the
what?
record in your ScreenFlow? The record type?
The record type. Yes, there is. I will show you a different way of doing that, but that's exactly what I'm doing right here with the get records. You can get an object type called record type, which will pull in that record type information into the ScreenFlow. I'm not sure you can do it using dynamic fields. I don't know if record type is listed here. I don't think it is. Since it's technically related to the object and not on the object itself. But you can use the get records to pull that in.
Perfect. So Heather would like to know, do you run into issues with conditional visibility on the dynamic fields?
I will be honest and say I haven't actually tried that yet. I haven't played a lot with dynamic fields yet, but I think it depending, like conditional visibility can definitely trip you up. First off, by making sure that your conditions are like, it's sort of like backwards of validation rules, like you want to show it when this is true versus when this is false. I've definitely had conditional visibility issues where I'm basing it off of a value that was earlier in the flow and it hasn't been updated, and then they can't see the thing that they're trying to see. So I will definitely say use conditional visibility with caution. And if somebody's like, I can't see that thing, and you're like, oh, you should be able to see it, check your conditional visibility. But I haven't run into it specifically with these dynamic fields yet, mostly because I haven't explored it too much. It did work in this
Fantastic.
example,
Okay.
though. So in this simple example, at least
Well,
it seems to work fine.
of course, which is always what we want on live demos, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep.
all right, Robert would like to know, and this is a can of worms, is there any way to validate input data on a ScreenFlow?
Yes, there is. So let's go ahead and look at this email one that I have here. Great questions. Like I planted that one, I guess. There's a couple different ways of doing it. The first easiest way is some components will allow you to validate it directly. So in this case, on this text field, this is actually just a text. This is not the email component. If we dragged the email component over here, once it loads, you'll see there isn't actually a way to set validation on the email component itself. So I have resorted to using a text component and then setting my validation with a formula. In this case, I want to check, does it have both the @ symbol and a period? This is not foolproof, by the way. This formula is for demo purposes only. You could definitely get around this easily in terms of entering an invalid email address. But it's going to check the formula to say, does this text that the person entered contain both an @ symbol and a period? And if it does, they're good. Otherwise, show them this error message. So if we look at what that looks like in debug here, I'm going to do internal support. I'm going to go ahead and let's just try this without any of that. If I click submit, first of all, there's the required fields over here. But secondly, it's going to say, please enter a valid email address because I haven't entered it correctly. Ditto if I did it like this. And then forgot the second half. Well, first it's going to tell me I need to put something over here. So we'll just give it something to make it happy. Oh, well, and now we have an unhandled fault. This is live delos, but you can see here that it says invalid email address, right? So we are trying to make that, we're trying to stop that. And what happened here actually is a really good example of I didn't write my formula carefully enough. And so this text that I entered, sarah.pilzer @ without the ending, has both a period and an @ symbol. And if we go back and look at the validation that I wrote, it meets my criteria perfectly fine, but is still an invalid entry. So this is just a really good example of why you have to be very, very careful when you're writing these things to have it be the exact behavior that you expected it to be. So that's one way of validating, is sort of your traditional validation rules type things. It doesn't work everywhere. So one other way that you can do it is, I'm not going to go through the whole example, but if I wanted to use this email component and I couldn't validate it here, what I could do is after my screen, I could add a decision that checked to see, hey, does this meet the criteria? And in my decision outcome, I would say whatever that screen component was, and then equals, either I could write a formula and put it in here as the value, because you can put lots of different things in here in a value. So I could like create a formula, put the formula in, same deal as my validation formula here. And if it does equal it, great, continue on. If it doesn't, send it back to the screen. And you can even turn on a little error message toggle that says that will then display an error message. And I can show that example offline if you're interested, follow up with me. So there's a couple different ways of doing that. That was a long-winded answer, but can of worms.
Validations and flows always are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yeah, Hasu came back. While it's possibly beyond the scope of this presentation, possibly the regex function in Salesforce can help with validation. Again, I think it's one of those things where it's great, but boy, regex is tough. I still struggle with it for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's lots of different ways people have decided to try and validate. I really just wish we had validation rules in Flow, to be honest.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Right. Okay. So Sita would like to know how you were able to bring the case new record variable into your screen flow.
Great. So I went ahead and created a new resource, and that new resource type was a variable. And I gave it a name. In this case, my naming convention is, if I'm creating a record variable, I'm going to start with S_object, which is a little esoteric, but Salesforce language. And then just give it a descriptive name. So this is case, and we're going to say another case, right? I tell Salesforce that I want it to be a record. And then I tell it what kind of variable I want it, or what kind of object I want it to be. In this case, it's going to be a case. And always put a description, like a good doobie. So once I do that, and I say this is going to be a new resource available to use in my flow, and I click done, it shows up here under my record single variables. And now in any element, I can go ahead and reference those record variables that I've created. So I can create another case, the new one we just created, or I can do that new that I did before I started the webinar. You'll also notice that what shows up here sometimes are your records from get. If you have like a get records element in your flow, that'll show up as a record variable that you can reference as well. So that's
cool.
how
All
I
right. So
found that.
Perfect. The last question we have right now, can you give us an idea of the total time, start to finish, it takes you to build a flow like this? Is it hours, days, somewhere in the middle?
At this point, I built this particular flow in a number of hours. I think it was like maybe 1 or 2 hours. And the biggest part of that, for me, having built lots and lots and lots of these, is the design thinking of like, how is this gonna, like, how am I gonna lay this out? One thing I didn't touch on, because I wanted to get right into the building stuff because I'm a nerd like that, was the design process, which is also really important. I've taken to actually either sketching things out on paper or using a tool like Lucid Chart or even PowerPoint to like just create a sketch of what I want the flow to do before I actually start building. So in this case, I would say, okay, I need to collect information from my users, and then I need to decide what kind of case to make. And then I need to specify what the fields are going to be, and then I need to create my case, right? So it's like this sort of just a sketch of like, how does this go? And that'll give you your basic form. And that piece often takes the longest, in fact. And once I've gotten that down, I can just dive in and start building on Flow Builder. There are other flows that I've built. The screen flow, the one that I just showed you, a little screen cap from our Experience Cloud site, our registration, camp registration flow is, at this point, it's a single flow with lots of other subflows, which I'm not going to get too far into that, but that took me, including design process, probably 3 months to build, 4 months, and we're still making tweaks to it. So it can be a small amount of time or a large amount of time, I guess. But I would expect the first couple that you build, if you're pretty, as you're just starting out, don't get discouraged if it takes you a couple days or a week or longer. And I will say that whenever I'm building flows, I always build in iterations. So like, this is just the first version of this flow. If we go ahead and I want to take a next look at the next version, you'll see I have actually several iterations between. This is sort of what it turned into, right? And so this process, I took that first one, built it in a couple hours, and then I played around with it and thought about it a little bit more. And then I spent another hour or so adding some things. So the overall time from start to finish can get lengthy if you include all the different versions that you're building of a flow.
Yes, iterate on an idea.
Yeah.
All right, so Don has a question, and I'm really interested to hear your opinion on this too, actually. Is it better on a get records action to let the flow get all the fields, or to specify just the fields you need? And especially, does that change if you're only interested in getting a single record?
Yes. So I have definitely defaulted recently to storing all fields. I haven't personally, I work in a relatively small organization without a lot of records, without a huge amount of data. I have not noticed any performance issues. What getting all the fields allows you to do is if you can't reference a field that you haven't gotten, right? So unless you exactly know everything that you're going to do with that record in your flow, you might forget one when you're setting it up, and you'll have to go back and add it. I certainly have gone back to some older flows that I built before this was even an option, and I'm like, oh, I want to upgrade, I want to iterate on that flow, but oh, I don't have the field I need. Now I need to go back and add it. So I don't know if it's laziness or if it's efficiency, but I tend to store all the fields. That said, certainly if you have a big org, or you have a custom object with like a ton of fields on it and you know you're not going to need half of them, you can choose which fields. You can either choose the fields and then let Salesforce create the variable, or just create your own variable and then choose your fields. And this, I don't know, for folks who've been doing this for a while, this is what we used to have to do. So maybe I'm a little bit like, oh gosh, I don't have to do that anymore. I'm never going to do it again. But yeah, I lean towards storing all the fields. And it's interesting, I'm doing a little bit of studying or taking an Apex course recently, and one of the things they highlight is that if you're doing a SOCL query, which again is sort of what get records is, it's you're searching the database, you can't reference a field later in your Apex if you haven't gotten it in that query. So I think this is very similar to that.
So I cannot verify this 100%, but I believe that I heard somewhere that Salesforce actually optimizes the process of getting those fields.
Oh.
So when it does the get records, it only pulls the fields that it actually needs in the flow, even if you tell it to get all of them.
Actually,
so,
yeah.
Once upon a time, there was an admin who didn't do this because we built flows the old way, and then she went back and updated flow and forgot to add fields, and it wouldn't work, and she couldn't figure out why, and she cried, and it was terrible, and that admin was me. So from personal experience, I always do to get all the fields, because quite frankly, I was so tired of my flows not working when I would change them. And again, I have not ever run into an issue with any limits or anything like that. So while I'm sure there's as many opinions on that as there are stars in the sky, I think here you are going to hear us tell you that you should just let Salesforce store all of the fields. Luckily.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen in debug, I don't think this one is going to do a good example of that, but I have seen in the get records, it'll tell you what fields it pulls back, and it is a smaller list based off of what gets used later on in your flow. So Flow is smart enough to say, oh, you referenced that field later in the assignment, I'll pull it during this get records. But for some fields that it doesn't reference, I haven't seen that in the debug. So I think what you said is spot on. Just let
Hey,
Salesforce do
sometimes
it.
it
It's
proves to be
smarter than me
smarter than you
anyway.
know you are.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
Perfect. All right, so Kristen agrees with us. Just let Salesforce do the work. Some other webinars is basically the same thing. You don't know what you might need in the future, so just let Salesforce handle it. Jamie's comment to this, you're paying enough for Salesforce, make it do the work. That cracked
Awesome.
me up, I love that. So Sita came back and said, thanks for explaining the record variable, and also thanks for the recommendation or reminder that design thinking is so very key before you start the flow. And I think that's definitely an important thing that when you're new, sometimes you can forget because we're all excited to get to the building part. But no good builder builds without plans from an architect. So you should definitely draw it out and have an idea where you're going so that when you finish, it actually looks like what you need it to.
Yep. Cool. I know we're just about out of time, but I just wanted to show you, this is the back end version of the flow that I showed you at the beginning of the demo, where it has multiple screens. I sort of split some things up. So if we do a debug version of this, you'll see that, again, this is achieving the same goals. It's just sort of the slightly zhuzhed up version of it. I'm going to go ahead and say I want to do a feature request. In this case, let's say I'm going to say a field, and that's, again, you just noticed that this object pick list showed up before, whereas if I select none, it's not there. That's conditional visibility for you. Thank you very much. I'm going to say, oh, I want to make a new field on the account. I'm the requester and I'm from the admin department. Yay, that's great. One quick thing you'll see down here, I actually now have a back button, which I have customized to say select different case type, because if you click that, it takes you back to this page where you can choose between them. And this is a quick choice component from Unofficial SF. They have very cool bells and whistles for your flows. Go check them out. So if we go ahead and do this, you'll notice, oh, it actually remembered what I had before because I specified that it could do that. So great, I went back, but then I changed my mind. It remembered, great, I don't have to enter it again. If I click next, now I have another screen asking me for more information. Where I'm gonna go ahead and enter my additional information, and then I'm gonna go ahead and submit it and have my success. So just a very brief, in our last couple of minutes, example of how you can start to make your screen flows a little bit fancier once you have the basic functionality that you need. But again, these are all just bells and whistles. The simple versions work just as well as the fancy versions do. So,
Amen to that. I think one of the things I tell everybody getting started with flows is that if it does what you need it to, you are successful. And you can always go back, and anything could use refactoring and zhuzhing up, like you said, right? So as long as it does what you need, that's a success.
Yep. Absolutely. I think I neglected at the beginning because my bio slide wasn't showing. Let me just throw that up real quick in case people want to connect with me later. You can email me at sarah@cdss.org or find me on the Trailblazer community. I love talking to people about flows, and I am not shy about hopping on a Zoom call and helping you with your individual flow issues. So please reach out. It's been my pleasure to be here and share about my favorite thing, screen flows. Hooray.
Awesome. We actually had a couple more questions come in with
Oh,
you
yeah.
showing that last version of your flow.
Great.
So Kavita would like to know, how did you get that Apex action? And Sita would actually like to know, what is the Apex action that you have in here?
Yeah.
Or what is an Apex
Yeah.
action in general? Because you said the A word, Sarah.
I did. So these little actions, actually, let me zoom in differently. So Apex actions are little chunks of code that are formatted to be able to be used in Flow. And you can drag them onto your screen the same way you can with other elements. And you have to know sort of what the action is called. And again, these are all methods. These are all little bits of Apex. Many of these come standard with Salesforce. Some of them I have snagged from unofficial SF. Again, like you might tell, I've mentioned it like 6 or 7 times now. I love that website. I go there a lot. And the ones that I'm using in this flow in particular, I remember we had, oops, sorry, my screen goes blank sometimes. We had mentioned how to get the record types using a get records. You can also use Apex. This is an action that I got from unofficial SF, and what it does is you just say, what is the object? And then it gives you back the record type IDs and the record type names that go with that record type. It's not pulling back the actual record type itself. It's just telling you a list of names and a list of IDs. But that's really handy if what you want is to use that list to configure another component. So in this case, I'm using the names that I'm getting back to configure the names that show up in this quick choice. So this is, again, this component is sort of like an upgrade from a pick list or a radio button, where it allows me to create choices. Instead of creating those choice resources, you kind of create them directly in the component itself. And then I use that information that I selected to go ahead and actually still get the actual record type record, as opposed to just the name that I got from this Apex. And then I'm using another little bit of Apex at the end of my flow to navigate to the case record. So on that final screen, this button bar is another custom component from unofficial SF, I believe, where if they click view case, I have a decision that says which button do they click. If they clicked view case, it goes to this action. What this Apex does is it says, hey, go to that record that is the ID that you specify. In this case, it's the ID of that new case that we created. I have no idea how this works under the hood. I don't need to, because it's already been coded for me, and I can use it in Flow just by configuring it without having to know how the code actually works. So that is a little brief intro of how to put Apex into your flows. It's one of those, like, if you trust it, if you trust the black box, great. If you're nerdy like me and really want to know what's going on behind the curtain here, like, that is why I'm now taking an Apex course, so that I can learn more about what's actually happening, because I was kind of like, well, I use this, but I don't know how it works and I want to. So
Absolutely. And there are several excellent ones out there for sure.
yeah, so much functionality you
Fantastic.
can add to your flows.
Oh, I know, right? So,
Mhm.
well, the thanks and the congratulations and kudos are rolling in. We've got Deb, we've got Maida, we've got Sita, all saying, you know, this is great. Thanks for all those awesome presentations from you, Sarah, which I wholeheartedly second.
Hey.
Kristen also said thanks for the demo. So I think we are doing a phenomenal job, and we have also gotten all of the questions that have come in answered. So
Oh,
as
great.
always, thank you everyone for joining. Sarah, thank you again for presenting.
Mhm.
And we will see everybody on the next episode of Automation Hour. Have a great rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.